Good morning, welcome to the Behaviour for Learning lecture. My name is Amit Pooney. Hopefully you've got a chance to watch the little introductory video. So, ordinarily I would lay down some ground rules because there'd be a lot of discussion, but I'd model a way in which to gauge pupils' attention. I give them this rule of the elephants, and I explain that I love elephants for two reasons. A, because they're vegetarian, but B, because they have massive ears and they're great listeners. So over the course of the session, ordinarily I would have them doing a lot of discussion, and then hence when they see the elephant on the side, that means I need their attention. But for the purposes of this session, the elephant will just be a sort of trigger for you to know that we're going to come back and I'm going to continue on with the lecture. Perfect. So what I'd like to do to begin with is I'd like to get you to envision or imagine your ideal learning environment. So in three ways. So firstly, what is the learning environment like? And often, depending where you're reading around education, in the States and in Australia, they refer to it as a class climate. So what's the learning environment in the room like? What does it feel like? The second thing I want you to think about is how is the behavior of pupils in that room? And the third thing is, how is your behavior and what are your emotions like? So you've got a piece of paper. I'd like you to respond quickly to those questions and then resume the video when you're done. Alright, excellent. What I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to compare your ideal learning environment with your own learning environment. So when you were in school, what was your learning environment like? What was the class climate like? How was the behavior of students or pupils while you were in secondary school? And what was the behavior of the teachers like when you were in school? Give you a moment to reflect upon the differences there. Chances are you probably had some very varied responses based upon your experiences and maybe how long ago you were in secondary school, or maybe where you attended secondary school, where in the country, which part of London, or was it even in this country? And of course, even if it was in the country or a specific borough within London, we know that different schools have different behavior policies, and different schools have different codes of behavior expected from students. And working in your placement is no different. You're going to be working in various schools with probably largely similar behavior policies, and maybe different teachers enacting different behavior management techniques. And even within your school, or even within the departments that you're placed in, you might be working around the same parameter of the same behavior policy, but the way that teachers enact upon that policy might be very different. So what we do know is that pupils, regardless of behavior policies or measures or sanctions, pupils generally act differently for various teachers. And you might know this to be true from your own time in school, or you might know this to be true from your visits or observations in schools. We know that different pupils will act differently for different teachers. And that's interesting. And we'll start to consider why that might be. In today's session, we're going to look at this idea of B4L, so behavior for learning. And behavior for learning is very much a form of tacit knowledge. And what I mean by tacit knowledge is those forms of knowledge which are difficult to transfer or acquire through sort of reading or writing. They're attained mostly through observation and sort of applied practice. And as Greg talked about in the previous lecture, this idea of ITT, so initial teacher training versus initial teacher education, and the differences there. So we're at Kingston, we're very much rooted in this idea of teacher education. So the PGC is actually a blend, I'd say, in some aspects. So at the university, I'm sure in your past 2 weeks, you've been getting lots of readings and presented with lots of ideas, principles, and theories of teaching and learning. And then when you go into school through your classroom practice, you'll pick up the tacit knowledge, those forms of knowledge and experience which are gained through being in the field. So today's session, I want you to start thinking about behavior in classrooms and your role as a teacher in shaping that behavior. But ultimately, this year is very much about developing your own teaching style or philosophy. As I said to my group, as teachers, you're always presented with lots of information, starting with teacher training all the way up throughout your teaching careers. So it's really up to you to sort of take on what works for you and trial and error different ideas until you eventually develop your own teaching style and philosophy. So by now, I'm assuming you would have already had a little bit of a look at the teacher standards. So how does this lecture link to that? Well, specifically, Behaviour for Learning will link to two teacher standards. One, setting expectations, setting high expectations which inspire and challenge pupils, and standard 7, managing behaviour effectively to ensure good, safe learning environment. But what we know about the teacher standards is, although there's 9 standards, 8 in part 2, the role of a teacher, the role of a teacher might cross into several different teaching standards. So you're never filed away nicely in terms of, oh, I'm doing standard 1 right now, and this part of the lesson will be just standard 2. We know that teaching is holistic, and a lot of the actions that are done in the classroom tick off multiple standards. So the overview of the session. So we're going to start to look at what is behavior for learning, and we'll consider the ways in which to promote behavior for learning within the classroom. Ordinarily, we'd have quite a practical seminar, but I'm assuming that your seminar leaders your subject leaders will follow this up with behavior through their own subject in the week. So, next, I'd like you to consider, what does learning in the classroom actually look like? So, consider, if you were to walk into a lesson of a good teacher, what behaviors are you likely to see students engaged in? Give you a moment to jot down your ideas and then resume the video when you've done. Well, there's a range of learning behaviors, and in fact, Powell and Dodd undertook that as a research question. So they went into a range of different settings, all the way from early years all the way up until key stage 4 and 5. And what they found, some of the key behaviors of learning are here on the side. So they found pupils were engaged, they were collaborating, they were participating, they were communicating in various ways. They were highly motivated. There was a range of independent activity. They were very responsive to the tasks, each other and the teacher, and students were held themselves in self-regard and high self-esteem, and there was a sense of responsibility. I'd like to add something. I think that if you walk into a lesson of a good teacher as well, I'd like to think that you'd see the process of people having fun, and there's enjoyment. There's a sense of joy in the classroom, a sense of easiness and safety, psychological safety, where children feel safe. But what we do know about learning behaviors is that actually they transcend all areas of the curriculum. So that means regardless if they're in a PE lesson or a science lesson or a sociology lesson or a math lesson, we know that good teaching, the principles are the same and they transcend different curriculum areas and different age phases. So, for instance, motivation in the early years, all the way up until secondary, might manifest and look differently at each age phase, but the principles are the same. The principles of good teaching are generally the same, but they manifest differently in different age phases. And we know that learning behavior is essentially the focus for pupil behavior and development. So if children want to make good progress, which Ofsted is all about, and your department, you'll soon find out progress is a massive word. Well, in order to support with progress, learning behavior is central to this. And the third thing we can recognize from this list is that learning behaviors recognize the social, emotional, and cognitive components of development that are underpinned by a set of relations. We'll come back to this idea of relationships because it's very central to our framework. All right, excellent. So behavior management versus behavior for learning. Oftentimes, when people come into this lecture, they think they're going to leave with a top 10 list of things to do in the classroom to manage pupils. That's not what you're going to get. We're going to look at the differences between behavior management and behavior learning. So, behavior management, in the first sense, is about management of negative or challenging behavior. I'd say those sorts of disciplinary actions done to pupils. It's this idea of behavioralism, so a stimulus response model. Student acts out of line, you respond and reprimand like this. A very robotic sort of a system. And this is a picture here of Michel Foucault. Foucault was very much interested in how power operates within the institution. And I'd argue that power operates very much within the policies, but then the policies are enacted upon and interpreted by teachers in various ways to discipline over the student body. So behavior management are those sort of punitive measures of behavior, whereas behavior for learning focuses on the promotion of positive values within the classroom, sort of cultivate a learning environment for students. So behavior for learning is the ways in which pupils learn their social knowledge and behavioral expectations, so it's whole class like, and whereas behavior management is usually one-to-one generally. So the conceptual framework or behavior for learning encourages teachers to reflect continually upon their own behavior management strategies. And I would argue that behavior management is part of a wider behavior for learning conceptual environment, but it's not the focus of it. Yeah. So we did brush upon this, but not in any detail, this idea of the classroom climate. So the classroom climate refers to sort of that prevailing mood or attitude, standards, expectations and tones that you and your students feel when you're in the classroom. A negative class climate or learning environment can feel hostile, chaotic, out of control, generally a tense environment. And a positive climate or learning environment feels safe, pupils feel safe, it's respectful, it's welcoming, it's supportive of student learning. And that's a big thing. The center here is very much pupils' progress or student learning. So I'd like to get you to pause there for a moment. I'd like you to consider, why might students behave poorly? So resume the video once you have a few ideas. Why might students behave poorly? You've probably come up with a whole slew and list of answers, but broadly speaking, they probably can be categorized into three sorts of areas. So we'll start with social emotional. So those are factors such as um, attention seeking behavior. People might act out. They might have had a fight with their mom on the way to school, and hence they're in a bad mood. They could have low self esteem. There could be a whole slew of social emotional factors there. In terms of cognitive, they don't understand the work and they don't want to put their hand up and humiliate themselves in front of the entire class and say that to you. There could be other issues in terms of, is there a specific learning need that's been diagnosed or not diagnosed? So, for instance, ADHD might affect you cognitively, but also biologically as well. So, for instance, if we jump over to biological, a whole range of things. Have they slept? They're teenagers. They're going through emotional, hormonal changes. So there's a whole range of issues. But the issue is that there are both internal and external reasons why they might act or behave poorly. So both internal in the sense of within the school, but also wider external forces as well. And so when we're considering behavior, I'd like to draw our attention to the iceberg model. So the iceberg model states that the behavior is just the tip of the iceberg, and the mass or the reasons of the behavior is under the surface. It's not visible to us. So, for instance, if a child in a lesson has an outburst, the outburst is just the tip of the behavior. That's just what we see manifested. And the reason for that behavior is very much under the surface. It's very emotional and social, things that we're unaware of or things that are likely to be happening that we can't see in that child's life. So, what we say is 90% of the behavior is caused by social and emotional issues, and 10% of it manifests in the physical outburst in the classroom. Now, this is not very likely to happen, but if it does, the whole idea is don't take it personal. Um, Generally, in terms of behavior, what you'll find in placement one is low level disruption. So, children chatting when you need them to get on with things, swinging on chairs, talking to their friends, perhaps on phones, and most of these sorts of behaviors can be sort of subsided with good, clear instructions, engaging lessons, and pace. I'd like to discuss Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you may have seen this. Um, my in order, I'd like to apply this to sort of an educational context. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is this pyramid, and he believes that in order for us to reach this level of self-actualization or sort of the optimal cognitive functioning, we need self-actualization. We need to have certain needs fulfilled, and if those needs aren't fulfilled, then we don't get there. But if we apply this to um, an educational or classroom setting, it's quite interesting. So within the classroom, the first needs that pupils need to have met in order to really be learning or at their highest sort of cognitive optimal level is your physiological or your biological needs. For instance, if a pupil is hungry or needs to use the bathroom, guess what? They're not paying attention and they're not taking very much in because they have physiological needs that need to be met. The behavior for learning framework really comes in the next three steps, really explicitly. So the next thing is that pupils need to feel there needs to be a sense of safety within that classroom. And what I mean by that is the class context needs to have clear structures, routines, and the adult or the teacher needs to be consistent in applying those in that structure and those routines. And the pupil needs to feel safe within that environment. And then the next thing is a sense of belonging. So pupils need to feel as though they belong, they're included, and everyone's included. It's a sense of of an inclusive practitioner. People's feel that it's a job of a teacher to galvanize the class. And the third one above that is self esteem. So, with the behavior for learning framework, if a teacher is able to create this environment, the impact is that it raises pupil self esteem. Pupils feel comfortable, safe, and a sense of belonging. They feel encouraged, and it raises their self esteem. And if all of those needs are met, then we get to this sort of optimal level of cognitive function. Moving on to the conceptual framework of behavior for learning. So if we look at the middle, we've got behavior for learning. Um, and this is built around relationships. Behavior is all about relationships, and in three senses. So it's about the relationship with the self, relationship with the curriculum, and relationship with others. And by others, that means peers, but also teachers. Uh, for modeling purposes, you can see here that the three types of relationships, the relationship with self, the curriculum, and others, are all housed sort of within this triangle of school context. However, there is external factors that the conceptual framework considers, such as family, wider policies in school or society, culture, community, and outside factors. So this model is transferable, but what I'd like you to think about for a moment is, out of the three relationships that impact behavior for learning, so going back to the relationship with the self, the relationship with the curriculum, and relationships with others, um, what do you anticipate you are most likely to have an impact on in school experience one? Uh, The first of the three concepts of relationship, so the relationship with itself, refers to this idea of internal thoughts, perceptions, feelings that learners have or develop about themselves. Okay, so it's that idea of relationships is self concept, self esteem, self confidence, and motivation. So, a lot of research at the moment against streaming of pupils. A piece of research by Becky Francis just in 2020 showed the negative impact of streaming right from the early years onto secondary. Uh, and Robert Holmes in 2019 shows how children are aware, even at primary and early years, in some cases where they're streamed, um, they're aware of which groups they're placed in, and it damages their self esteem and it sets expectations in terms of what they can do and what they can't do. So children align themselves with where they sort of fit into this hierarchy of the social group, the class, based on how they're being treated by the teacher or where they're being placed by the teacher and the sorts of questions or tasks they're given to do in light of the rest of the group. So this idea of streaming is actually quite contentious in educational research. And my feeling is over the next few years that we're going to see a shift away from these sorts of methods. So that's the first idea. I'd like you to consider for a moment, what can we do to develop pupils' self-esteem within our lessons? To give you a moment, what can you do as a classroom teacher to allow to develop pupil self-esteem within the lessons? Well, a way that you could develop self-esteem in learners is your use of praise, and I always say specific praise. specific about what you're praising the pupil for, not just, oh, that's good. Something along the lines of, oh, well done, Karam. I really liked how you had a go there. Or, oh, that's not quite right, but excellent. I really liked that you put your hand up and volunteered, or something along those lines. You can also, now I'd like you to reflect. Think back on your favorite teacher. What did you like most about them? Give you a moment. Um, and chances are, when you were reflecting upon your favorite teacher, you probably remember how they made you feel. And or if it's about how they taught, it's about how you felt during those lessons. I really like this quote by Maya Angelou. Give you a moment to read it there. So the second idea of relationships with others is about positive relationships that empower children to work collaboratively and make them feel comfortable sharing their opinions and their ideas and lessons. Um, and so it's very much about social learning, so the environment you create. Um, and you're the leader of that. You model positive relationships. Social learning theory can be traced all the way back to 1960s of the work of Bandura, um, and the impact of what positive role models play on the lives of young children. And more recently, the work of Music G talks about how social relations are crucial in developing neural pathways and having the ability to learn. So the second idea is this about idea of relationships with others. So that's your relationship. You set the standard in the classroom of how you expect behavior to be modeled. So how you treat pupils, how you speak to your colleagues in front of them, and is really the tone you expect, and how you challenge the interactions or between pupils as well. So, are you going to let it slide if you hear someone call another student a negative name? Or are you going to call it out? Interesting that you consider that. How are you going to referee that classroom? What are your non negotiables? What are you willing to let slide, and what are you definitely going to challenge? And the last relationship that the behavior for learning framework looks at is a relationship between the pupil and the curriculum. This is about this idea of access. Um, Negative behaviors, and you'll find this in your placement, they arrive at parts of the lesson in transition between activities. So, as they're coming into the lesson before the lesson starts, transition between starter and main as you're handing things out or transitioning from one task to the next. So generally, where there's not a clear instruction or a set task is generally when negative learning behaviors arise, or also in a sense where the task that you've given them is not clear to them, or it's too difficult, or it's too easy. That's really simply where negative behaviors often lie. So I really like this picture here. This picture is called Silent World into the World of Sound. It's a picture from 1974, and it was taken by Jack Bradley, and it depicts the exact moment this young boy Harold hears for the first time. And so you can see he's got a hearing aid in his ear. And I like to think that's the sort of power we have as a teacher, is by giving children access to the curriculum. So although the curriculum might not be as exciting in different parts or subject areas as we'd like, you have agency as a classroom teacher to translate that curriculum in an engaging, dynamic, and accessible way, so that it's pitched appropriately, and where possible always makes links to real life connections or how it be useful for people. What I'd like to say is it makes that so what really clear. So you've learned this, so what? It's all about application. To bring it all together, I was passed this document a few years ago, and I thought it was really interesting. It's from a sixth form college in Nottingham, and it looks at behaviour for learning from reluctant all the way to outstanding, and divided into four categories. I'll give you a moment to just briefly read a few of the key notes in each category. I'd say as trainee teachers, often your biggest fear is going into a classroom and having students reluctant, right? So not listening, not engaged, not motivated, not doing the task, or outright defying you. That's probably what I think is trainee teachers' probably largest fear. And then what we try and do is work them into the second quadrant, this compliant, where they sit there, they do as they're told, there's no talking. They put their hand up when you ask a question. They just quiet compliance. And I'd argue that that's probably not the best behavior either, because some of the lessons that I've been into, which are outstanding, pupils are really quite interactive, excited, and engaged. And so I'd say that the behavior for learning framework looks at how you move them from this idea of compliant all the way to outstanding. So, do we want learners to just sit there and do as we're told? What Foucault would say is that the power we want to hold over the body of students, these regulatory powers, so they're just compliant and listen to us. But I'd argue that the behavior for learning framework tries to get us to this sort of outstanding model. So, how do we do that? Well, it's all about how we build the learning environment in the classroom. So, how do we raise pupils' self esteem? How do we model good relationships? How do we referee the interactions between the pairs? And how do we model the type of behavior we want? And are we doing our part to make sure that the curriculum is engaging and differentiated and relevant to pupils that we teach? So we've looked at quite a few different relationships and factors that contribute to pupil behavior. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to get your pen and your notepad, and I'd like you to respond to this question. What will you do as a trainee teacher to promote behavior for learning within your classroom? Have a moment, respond to it, and then resume the video when you've responded. I often share this anecdote. What I say is that the classroom is it's a high stakes environment for teenagers, because for you it's just your training classroom where you'll be for your placement, and that's it. You'll finish your placement and move on. But for these secondary pupils, this is their entire social world in that classroom. It's their friendship groups, it's their professional peers, it's the people they hang out with outside of school and during school. And so you're coming into their social world. So what I'd say is be mindful, because it's a very high stakes environment for them. Their social image and reputation hangs in the balance. So, for instance, if you do need to reprimand a pupil, what I'd say is do it in private. So have a quiet word with them. There's an idea of praising in public and reprimanded in private. But if a pupil does cross the line, then you do need to set a precedence in the classroom and reprimand and explain why you're reprimanding. But generally, what I'd say is praise in public and have small, quiet, one-to-one discussions as you walk around the room. Um, and when you do need to reprimand a pupil in front of the entire group, be mindful of your language, your tone, your body language, your facial expressions. And lastly, remember that when you're speaking to a pupil one to one in front of the entire group, not only are you communicating with that child, you're also communicating to the rest of the group what your boundaries are, what your values are. So how you deal with that pupil, remember that conversation in public in front of the group is not just between you and child A, it's between you and child A, but also heard and interpreted by the rest of the group. So be mindful of how you carry yourself in that group. I'll give you a moment to read this quote by Hayam Ginott, who was an Israeli American psychologist and educator. Give you a moment to read this. I think it's quite a powerful quote that really sort of um, gets at the heart of the power you hold as a classroom teacher and the impact you can have on the self-esteem and self-worth of the young people in which you teach with, um, either to make their life miserable or joyous. Are you going to be that teacher that when they see your name on the timetable, they say, "Oh, I've got Mr. Pooney after lunch today, yes"? Or are you going to be that teacher where they say, "Oh, I've got Mr. Pooney after lunch today," and dread it? So really remember, it's in your response, in your behavior, and in the environment in which you set in that classroom has tremendous power and the impact of what you do. Cool. So just to recap, what can you do as a classroom teacher to promote behavior for learning? What you'll notice in placement is you're going to be inheriting different lessons and you're inheriting different learning environments. So you might have three different teachers' lessons that you take over from. And those will be three very different learning environments in some cases. Is that classroom teacher from September, from the time you take over, or depending upon your circumstance, they might have taught that the particular class a year before. So those learning environments, the rules and the norms have already been ingrained and you're taking over them. So it might be worthwhile when you're observing to really notice sort of what's accepted, what's not, what sorts of things does the teacher really challenge, what do they let go, what do they let slide, and have a look at how the pupils behave in that lesson, not just to the teacher but each other. So the first thing is really develop and reinforce classroom rules. Classroom rules help you create a predictable, safe learning environment for your students. It gives your students clear boundaries but also opportunities to self-regulate their behavior. The second one is about promoting positive peer relations. So you can role model positive relationships, but also reinforce positive casual interactions between students. So what I mean by that is if Nathan doesn't bring a pen in and you notice Natasha's taken her pencil case out and given him a pen, publicly praise that. Say, "Oh, well done, Natasha. That was very kind of you to let Nathan borrow a pen. But I know Nathan's going to return it and make sure to bring one in tomorrow." Something like along those lines. Pay attention to the social dynamics of the classroom. Do some particular students have trouble making friends? Um, who do students have trouble getting along with? You'd be able to tell the friendship groups right away or after a while. Who has lots of friends? Who's the pupil that's quite quiet and withdrawn in your lesson? Consider having one-to-one talks with pupils as you're going around and checking on work. Try and speak to each child at least once during your lesson. That might be as you stand at the door and you greet them with a good morning or good afternoon. Try and make eye contact and speak to each child as they enter your learning environment. The third thing is about nurturing positive relationships with all your students. Another way in which you can do this is rather than letting your students, sort of telling your students you care, because that's a bit cheesy, is show them that you care. How can you do that? Well, take an interest in them. If you've got a group of boys that happen to be on the football team, go out and watch a football game. Obviously, COVID permitting, that things will be different this year. Or if you've got children that sort of take an interest in a particular activity or things, speak to them about it. Speak to them in the hallways. Speak to them at break time or at lunchtime. Get to know them a little bit. And lastly, what I'd say is greet your students by name. Probably the best way is greeting them at the door and coming in. When you start teaching, you'll get a profile picture of each student. Those are generally available on a system that schools use called Sims or something similar, where they'll have the student name and the picture, and keep a clipboard so as you're referring to pupils you can get to know their names. And please get to know how you pronounce their names, or students would prefer to be called something different. These are the sorts of things that show that you care. Use use inclusive sort of expressions, tones, body language, encouraging, smile, be positive, relax, enjoy the experience. Um, and notice any sort of emotional behaviors in students. You'll be there's this so you'll be able to tell quite quickly if a student puts their hand up and you praise them. You'll be able to see that you've built them up by their facial or emotional reaction. Or if they put their hand up and you've said no, sorry, and you've just moved on. And you can see sometimes pupils' faces will just drop and their bodies will slump. So be really mindful in terms of how you're dealing with these students within the classroom. This is quite a useful checklist. It's taken from the Department of Education. The document's called Getting the Simple Things Right. It's a behavior checklist for teachers. What I'll do is I'll get you to pause here and read through our list. One of the key things that I haven't mentioned so far is really getting to know your school's behavior policy. It will be one of your induction tasks that you'll do during your weeks of observation before teaching, but really get to know the behavior policy. And I'd say be consistent in the way in which the class teacher whose lesson you take over enacts upon it. So you'll notice that different teachers apply that policy in different ways. So what I'd say is just be consistent with how you're applying it. And as long as you're firm, fair, but consistent, students will respect you. One of the most overlooked aspects of behavior for new teachers is the self, and teachers never consider their own behavior and their impact that their behavior is having in the rest of the class. So be the model of behavior you expect in that lesson. Going back to another psychological idea, consider internal versus external locus of control. So when things go wrong in that classroom, do you start blaming everyone else but yourself? Where is your loci? Where is your locus of control? Do you have an internal locus? Where does power lie in that room? Or is there an external locus? So what can you do? Because we recognize that a lot of behavior for individual pupils, the reasons are for issues outside of school, but within that learning environment, what can you do to change, create a positive behavior for learning environment? The power of praise. We talked about praise slightly, but what I'd say is be mindful of the way your expressionality with the students, the way in which you're speaking to them. So, for instance, if someone has their headphones in on lesson, rather than saying, take your headphones out, you know the school rules, and standing there over them in front of taking the entire class's time and waiting for them to do it. So now you've created a stage and a standoff between you and that pupil. Probably something better along the lines of, can you get your headphones out? Thanks. And then walk away. Get the class's attention on something else. Take that stage away from them. And then go back in a moment once the class is on task, or you've gone, or we're on a different activity, and check if they've taken their headphones out. And if they haven't, then you can probably crouch down on their level, have a quiet word. What's going on? I did ask you to take your headphones out. And if that doesn't work, then the classroom teacher's in there and we can go through sort of the different behavior responses in escalation. Um, what I'd say is what you don't want to do is create that environment where you've told them, take your headphones out in front of the whole classroom and now you're waiting and you've stopped everyone's learning and waiting for this pupil to respond. Because you, as I said, you've created a stage and a platform now, and there can only be one winner, either that pupil or you. So either that pupil just is compliant and takes their headphones out and that's it, or the teacher refuses. And in that sense, depending upon how you act, again, you're in a standoff. So what I'd say is, look, teenage egos are fragile. So give them a moment, de-escalate, and then come back, as I explained. Consider the use of restorative conversations. For instance, if that child did reluctantly take their headphones off or kiss their teeth or something, what I'd say is, that's fine. Choose your battles, and then at the end of the lesson, say, "Oh, Natalia, can you wait?" And as she's leaving, I just want to speak to you quickly and have a restorative conversation about what happened in that lesson. Why you asked that child to take their headphones off, why they decided to kiss their teeth, but not in public, I'd say. Another key idea is probably praising those on task first. So, for instance, if you've asked the task is that students have to look at two pictures on the whiteboard and respond to a question. What I'd say is praise the behavior you expect. So say, "Oh, well done, Abdul. Well done, Jacob. Well done, Kaylee, for getting on with the task right away." And what you'll notice is that eventually you're praising the positive behaviors you want rather than just calling out students. "Oh, Nathaniel, I told you to get on with the task." Now it's about praising those around them in the first instance. And the reason for that is, consider, and you'll get to know this throughout the year. You're going to have so many lesson observations, and what you'll remember is the negative feedback a lot more than the positive. So what I'd say is, be as positive as you can, as often as you can within that classroom. This is probably a typical exchange in the classroom. I'll give you a moment to read this and then continue the video once you've finished. Should have had a chance to read that. What are your initial reactions? How did the teacher handle the situation? See if you can rewrite that with a more of a positive approach. So rewrite that interaction, you being the teacher. See if you can handle it in a different way. And then resume the video once you've finished. Sometimes when you're teaching, you're going to have these moments in your career where it's a real sort of an epiphany or a shock of recognition of something. And I had one probably about 7 years ago. And this is a real interaction between me and a student. I was on patrol, so what that meant is every Thursday, lesson 2, it means that certain members, senior members of staff would be on patrol. What that meant is if anything was happening in lessons or anything around the school, you'd get radioed and you'd have to support it. Now I was really used my Thursdays, lesson 2, to do some planning and marking. So every Thursday I would get called to the same RS lesson, and so it was the same boy outside each time. So I thought, right, I'm not gonna have this. I'm gonna sit down with this boy. Gonna get to the heart of the issue. So this is how the conversation transpired. So this is what I said. Every time I'm on patrol, I always have to take you out of the same 2 lessons. What seems to be the issue in these lessons? And this is what he said. He said, "Well, sir, Miss So-and-so just hates me. Every time she kicks me out, I swear down, sir, the whole class messes around. She's always blaming me. She can't control the class, you know." And I said, "Okay, interesting. And what about the other lesson?" "Oh my days, sir, don't even get me started on Mr. He's bare strict, but his lessons are dead. We always do worksheets in silence." And I said, "Ah, you seem to be an expert in teaching." And he said, "Sir, I'm in lessons all day. I know when I'm in a good one." And the moment he said that, it just hit me, and I thought, you know what? Actually, he's right. These pupils are in lessons all day for so many years. They certainly know when they're in a good lesson. And I thought it was a real moment where the penny just dropped for me. Right, let's return back to the task that I set you to rewrite that script. I'll give you a moment. Have a read of this script that I've rewritten. What do you think? Right, what? Cool. Your next task is I'd like you to take these common phrases that can be heard in any lesson, in any secondary school, choose one and rewrite it in a positive way, and then resume the video once you've finished. Here are some examples of some of them that I've rewritten in a positive way. And the last thing I'd like to get you to do to sort of end our lecture is start to consider your teaching style. I'll leave a list of videos to look at. This is a bit of a comedy sketch about a teaching style. What I want you to consider is, what type of teacher do you want to be? How would you like to be remembered? What will you do to promote positive behavior for learning in your classroom? So to analyze or sort of break those questions down further, what type of teacher do you want to be? Consider the following. How will you appear to them? What's the school's staff behavior policy? How are you going to go in? Semi-casual, wearing a suit, smart? How will you talk? Are you going to be relaxed? Are you going to be super formal? Are you going to be arrogant? Are you going to be condescending? Will you be conversational in your one-to-one interactions with them? Will you be approachable? The third one, how will you move around the room? Will you be frozen and nervous at the front of the classroom? Will you circulate the room smiling, making eye contact at a reasonable distance, of course? Often trainee teachers, the performance, I always say this, is very much on themselves. What am I doing? How am I appearing? And as you move on throughout the year, that there's a shift. So rather than what you're doing, it's what are they learning? How are they understanding it? So that shift will happen. But in the beginning, it's very much the performance of the self. Um, how will you treat your students? Are you going to be an authoritarian approach? Will you be polite? Are you going to talk down to them? Will you go in too softly? Are you going to be really strict? What I'd say is it's probably best to start off firmer and then maybe soften your approach. But what you don't want to do is start too strictly or too firmly, because you'll turn students away from the first lesson. So it's a real art of how you want to pitch yourself. So consider that. How will you start and end each lesson? So consider having a real repertoire. All my classes always know I say the same things and they'd repeat it to me as they enter. Dates on the whiteboard, bags, jackets, coats off, under your tables, pens out. And they'd repeat that to me as they come in because it's a routine and repertoire which I established. Timings, how are you going to manage the time in the classroom? Are you going to use um, a Google Classroom timer? You're going to have a manual timer. Um, where will you first meet your students when you're teaching them? Will they come into the room? Will you be sitting down? Will you go outside and greet them in the hallway? How will you first introduce yourself to the students? It might be worth having a chat with your classroom teacher to see how you're going to be introduced. There's nothing worse than being introduced as a trainee teacher. Nothing like delegitimizing your authority before you start. So consider how you'd like to be introduced. I usually say whatever scheme of work we were doing. So if we were doing something on law, I would say, oh, this is Miss Sadia, and she's an expert on law, and she's really excited to work with us for this term. So I know you'll be great because I've told her all wonderful things of how great of a class you are. So consider how you'd like to be introduced to the class for the first time. How will you teach your lesson? Will it be fun? Will it be challenging? Will it be engaging? How will you teach that lesson? Will you be enthusiastic, passionate, like you care, even if it might be a really dry topic? Or are you not really bothered and you're looking at your time and checking your phone in lesson? How are you going to come across? How are you going to gather the class's attention? Are you going to count down from 5? Are you going to come to a particular spot in the classroom and put your hand up? Consider that. I'm going to end there. I'm just going to talk you through the rest of the PowerPoint where there's links to videos which I'll leave. This is a link to a video by Bill Rogers, quite an interesting shout. So that. Here's another examples of strategies to take control of a noisy class. I'll leave a video link to that. And lastly, to recap, this is Jason Bengbala, who's a bit of a behavior guru in the teaching world. It's his 5 qualities of an excellent teacher in terms of behavior. Give you a moment to read that to end on. Lastly, I'd like to look, to end with behavior, what I say is, look, you're gonna have some classes which aren't great. You're gonna have some instances where upon reflection you've realized you've handled it wrong, but the most important thing is to be honest and reflective in your approach, because that's how you'll learn. And lastly, I'd like to end by saying thank you for your attention. I recognize it's never easy sometimes to do this stuff online, especially with the sheer volume of how much online stuff you have. But as I've said to my group, we're really fortunate because a lot of other institutions are completely online. So hopefully you're appreciating your subject days. Best of luck in your teaching, and most of you I will see in January for your second academic module, and of course my group I will see next week. Best of luck and thank you.